Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
So I just want to start by introducing myself. My name is Mary Neuberger, and I am the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I'm the chair of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I'm also a professor in the Department of History, and I focus on Bulgarian history, Southeast European history. And Kirill Abramov is my co-host.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neuberger. My name is Kirill Avramov. For those who are meeting me for the first time, I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I'm also a fellow in the Intelligence Studies Project. My interests are in the field of political warfare and propaganda. However, I enjoy all things Balkan, and it's a distinct privilege to meet you for the seventh time this semester on the Balkan Circle, where today we have a very interesting and exciting topic, which I hope will create a lot of lively discussion, as we usually have. And our guest today is an associate professor of anthropology and the director of Center for Law, Justice, Culture at Ohio University. Her name is Dr. Smoki Musaraj, and her research focuses on anthropology of money and value, informal economies, speculative bubbles, anthropology of corruption, post-socialist transformation, and the societies of Southeast Europe and the Mediterranean. She is author of the new book that we'll be discussing today, The Tales from Albarado, Ponzi Logics of Accumulation in Post-Socialist Albania, that was published by Cornell Press in 2020. And she's also the co-editor of Money at the Margins, Global Perspectives of Technology, Inclusion, and Design, which was published by Berhan in 2018. So it's my distinct pleasure to invite Dr. Musaraj to present her newest book today and to give us a chance to have questions about all those exciting and really puzzling phenomenon that we thought is well gone past in the 90s. However, obviously, it is not the case. Dr. Musaraj.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much to the Center for European and Eurasian Studies at University of Texas, Austin. I wish I could come there in person, maybe one day in the future. And I want to especially thank Dr. West, Dr. Neuberger, and Dr. Avramov for your invitation to the Balkan Circle. And thank you for a very kind introduction. So today I will be talking about my book that just came out. And let me just first share the screen. So I will be going through slides and talking through the book, and hopefully we can also have some conversation at the end. So let me try this. Can everyone see it? Okay, awesome. So the book that I just published, Tales from Albarado, Ponzi Logics of Accumulation in Post-Socialist Albania, was published by Cornell University Press in 2020. The book is based on ethnographic and archival research. The bulk of this research took place in 2008-2009, which was a decade after the pyramid schemes had collapsed. And then I had my dissertation, and then I returned to the field actually several times during the summers of 2015 and 2017, and I collected new archival materials and followed up with some of my informants as I was revising the dissertation to turn into a book. Tales from Albarado revisits times of excitement and loss in late 90s Albania. This was a time of deep political and economic transformations that followed the end of the Cold War, the collapse of one of the harshest communist regimes in Eastern Europe. It was a time of excitement for people in Albania who felt free after decades of a dictatorship. It was also a time of disappointment. Many Albanians yearned to go west, to European countries and the United States, and as they tried to do so, they ran into the long waits and the closed doors of embassies and a forbidding visa regime. Mass migration by boat, by foot, by air ensued nonetheless. In the midst of these major transformations, there emerged a dozen of Ponzi schemes, locally referred to as firma piramidale, which I translate as pyramid firms, and that's the term that I'm going to be using in this talk. The pyramid firms were a mix of classic Ponzi schemes whereby money circulated from new investors to earlier investors, but some of them also had some features of joint stock companies, and I'll talk about this later. But there were joint stock companies that were running on a Ponzi finance model. This is a term from economist Hyman Minsky, and that is promising exorbitant future returns on investments in other assets or economic activities, but running these activities in a very unsustainable pattern. So these firms had an ambiguous status. They were part formal, part informal. All were legally registered as either compagnie or fondazione. Compagnie, companies such as Vefa and Camberi, which ads you see at the bottom of the slide, were registered as limited liability companies. They had investment in tourism, retail, construction, housing, agriculture, and etc. Foundations, fondazione, had no assets or investments to their name, and they conducted a pure type of Ponzi scheme. The earlier firms, Vefa and Sudev, which I will talk more about today, were established in 1993. By late 96, about 1.5 million investors, or about half of the country's population, is estimated to have invested in the firms. And I should note here that as we were having a little chat before the talk, pyramid firms, pyramid schemes emerged in other parts of Eastern Europe. I think what makes Albanian case special was the scale of the schemes and as I said, the percentage of population that participated, and also the scale of legitimacy that the schemes had at the time. Now, when they collapsed in 1997, the country fell into anarchy and a near civil war. The initial protests were first by former investors who were duped by the firms. And first they went to protest at the firms, but then they turned to the government and started to ask for government accountability for their firms and asked for their money back. There were, of course, other political reasons for the protest, for the anarchy. The sitting government had lost its legitimacy, but nevertheless, it was the collapse of the firms that sort of sparked this wave of violence and anarchy, and that caught media attention. Images of enraged, threatening Albanians flooded global media front pages. This was portrayed as irrational exuberance and ignorance of capitalism in a country that had only recently opened up to global markets. Needless to say, such representations reinforced Orientalist tropes of Albania as a Balkan state made up of irrational, hot-blooded people. Adding to these representations of a long durée of sort of Orientalizing the Balkans was also another set of representations of post-communist societies as being ignorant about the markets, the workings of the markets. These representations circulated globally and locally. So in my book, I challenge these representations, and instead I situate the rise of the firms at the intersection of two intertwined trajectories. On the one hand, the longer history of speculative bubbles in capitalist economies. On the other hand, the specific economic and social transformations of post-communist Albania. Rather than couching this story in the language of the occult practices that emerged in an exotic and enigmatic country in the Balkans, I show how the firms were made possible by global and local transformations, including the transformation from command economy to a free market economy, the Albanian government's eager embrace of shock therapy reforms, and very importantly, the emergence of a transnational remittance economy. I take this instance of financial speculation as a good case study for thinking more broadly about the economic crisis and speculative finance in the context of neoliberal economy, not just in post-communist Albania or in post-communist countries, but also globally. So my general argument in the book is that the firms emerged not from ignorance of capitalism, but were enabled by some of the economic process of the transition. This analysis echoes neo-Keynesian theories of bubbles and Ponzi finance that emphasize the role of economic and political transformation and what it's called periods of credit expansion as a catalyst for speculative finance. Now, I expand on these theories by taking a broader sociocultural understanding of economic concepts such as value, wealth, and credit. And so I draw from anthropology, from economic anthropology and anthropology of money and value. The transformation of the 90s indeed brought about what economists describe as credit expansion through the infusion of liquidity from structural adjustment loans and from the opening to the global markets. However, pyramid firms' investor stories also bring into focus other forms of credit expansion that do not fit the textbook definition of credit. So in the book, I highlight two non-bank forms of credit that played a role in the firms: remittance flows and privatized apartments that were sold for cash. By focusing on these two forms of non-bank credit, the book shows how the firms also built on financial repertoires that emerged from the ground up, and some of which continue to this day. And finally, the book argues that some of the economic logics and practices and some of the cultural aspirations that were mobilized through the firms continue to endure in contemporary Albanian economy and culture. Now, my contribution to sort of broader studies of speculative finance is that I'm doing what I call an ethnography of Ponzi schemes. So what do I mean by that? How does one do an ethnography of a Ponzi scheme? And the way that I'm approaching this from an anthropological perspective, and the way that I've sort of organized the book, is that I'm looking at discourses, materialities, socialities, and temporalities of the pyramid firms. And this is how I'm structuring this talk as well. Oops. Okay. So let me start with discourses of speculation. To understand how people trusted the firms, I looked into representations of the firms in official and popular discourse. I looked into the archives of several newspapers, noted numerous political speeches. I looked into some government documents, although there's not that many, it's very hard to get those. And then I looked at the legal framing of the firms at the time of their boom. Looking at these representations before and after their collapse, I paid close attention to the connotations of the various terms they used to refer to the firms and to describe their activities. One key finding of this research was that the firms were considered legal and legitimate at the time of their boom. There was official legal framing, such as the use of credit contracts, which were signed in the presence of a notary public, and which cited language from the new civil code. And there were specific political statements by political leaders that many of the investors referred to as a sort of sign of this was a source of credibility and legitimacy of the firms at the time. These findings speak more broadly to the anthropology of financial speculation, which looks at the socio-legal infrastructures that make speculation possible and legitimate. Another important finding in my research was the discourses around the firms changed dramatically before and after their collapse. More specifically, I noticed a highly gendered and ethnicized discourse that sought to legitimize some and delegitimize other firms. So the firms' leaders were represented as masculine entrepreneurs at the time of their boom. They were feminized at the time of their collapse. So, for instance, during the time of the boom, most newspapers, even those that were opposed to the regime, and actually this was a surprise to me, I don't expect this, they represented the firms as avant-garde of Albanian new capitalism, and part of it was that the firms were paying for the ads, right, for these newspapers. So one economic journalist, Barlisej Darasi, who is very respected, he writes about the firms as follows. Colossal investments are financed by the funds of the creditors, but also yielding visible gains that increase the citizens' interest in entering more credit contracts with lucrative gains. The vocabulary unmistakably points to a global register of banking and finance. Darasi described companies as investment banks with diverse portfolios. They're financing, they're providing lucrative gains to their investors. He further describes the firm's leaders as the new Albanian entrepreneurs. Quote, Vlora is attacking foreign hard currencies. Day after day, the city of the South, renowned for the large number of immigrants working abroad, for the excellent organization of clandestine migration, for the founding and developing of the firms and companies that represent the new image of the Albanian businesses and businessmen, is now becoming the capital of money lending. Now here we see what emerges is a post-communist entrepreneurial type that's incarnated in the figure of the firm's owners. And so some of the firm owners were really celebrated as the new entrepreneurs, the new capitalist entrepreneurs. And they appeared on stage alongside the president and other political leaders. And so part of this discourse is also metaphors of aggressive and instinctual masculinity. The metaphors of prey, attack, domination that I found in this article and other articles echo discourses of masculinity in global financial markets, past and present. Political economist Marieke de Goede notes in writing about European finance that finance as a profession has historically gained more respectability when associated with more masculine traits. These masculine traits, though, change over time. So and place, I would say. So for instance, in 18th century England, masculinity was defined through the affects of calculation, moderation, and accountability. In early 21st century, writes anthropologist Kathleen Zaloom, she notes that masculinity in the Chicago trading floor is expressed as an economic instinct rooted in a conception of human nature, so the sort of instinctual, aggressive type, rather than technical skill. Representations of the firms and their owners in Albania infuse these global entrepreneurial subjectivities with more culturally and historically specific types of masculinity. The firm leaders imparted some of the traits of what Catherine Verdery describes as entrepreneurship. These were, and I may be mispronouncing it, but it's a mix between entrepreneur and apparatchiks. So these are individuals who held managerial positions under the communist regime in running the communist factories and state enterprises. So these individuals were in charge of state resources, but they often used their access to these resources for personal gain or to accumulate political and social capital. They acted as big chiefs, using indebting generosity to accumulate power and wealth. A number of the Albanian firms owners, too, had occupied similar positions under communism. So Bebi Ali Muçaj, who I featured in this ad of VEFA, the owner of VEFA, one of the biggest, the first and the biggest firm, was a warehouse manager during the communist times and used many of his connections to the government as well as to other individuals to establish his firm. Many former investors at the time of my interviews were still loyal to VEFA and Ali Muçaj, even though he was in prison at the time of my interviews. A former manager at VEFA, for instance, described Ali Muçaj as a generous man with a big heart and a man from Kurveleshi, which is a highlands region of Vlora, infamous for maintaining the honor system. So in these portrayals, Ali Muçaj was represented as a man of honor who donated his wealth to VEFA's investors. Accolades of Ali Muçaj indicate how notions of masculinity attached to traditional honor code and to communist structures of power were translated into the discursive field that framed post-communist entrepreneurship. These persistent cultural representations of masculinity and entrepreneurship bestowed legitimacy on Ali Muçaj and VEFA. By contrast, the story of Maksude Kadona, the head of the Fondacion Sude, represents the feminization and ethnicization of pyramid firms as fraudulent entities. Most international media accounts of the collapse of the firms center on the story or on the figure of Maksude Kadona. A former worker in a communist shoe factory, Kadona was one of the first to set up a firm and the first to fold. Sude, her firm, from her name, like a nickname from her, Maksude Sude, was a pure Ponzi scheme. It had no investment in other areas of the economy, unlike VEFA. But its financial operation was not unlike that of VEFA and other firms, basically it was the same. And when it collapsed in 1997, protests ensued. These were the first protests that went from her house to the government buildings. Cadona captured global media headlines as a, quote, gypsy fortune teller who claimed to look into a crystal ball. This is a quote from a New York Times article in 1997. These depictions of Cadona were legion in Albania as well, but only after the collapse of Sudan. So media records before the collapse reported testimonies of investors who were shoe factory workers and who had joined Sudan. And they had a relationship with Cadona that preceded the 90s, and they trusted her because she used to run a rotating credit circle called Lotari. And it was a very common practice of sort of saving in groups in communist factories and enterprises. Representations of Cadona post-collapse, on the other hand, are written in grotesque remarks about her gender and ethnicity. So, for instance, in one of the memoirs, one of the most comprehensive memoirs by a politician who is also a poet and writer and former political prisoner. So he represents Cadona as follows. He writes, "The architect of this magnificent rebirth of the Roma community is the Honorable Sude Cadona, the most well-known daughter of the Roma community in Albania, the queen of goodness, accepted as such by the Albanian nation as well." And I should say that this is written with a lot of sarcasm and irony. But you can see there that the language of gender and ethnicity is prominent every time he and other writers similar want to delegitimize Sudan. So this depiction reflects a discourse of sexism and prejudice against the Roma and Egyptian communities in Albania. And so Cadona was a scapegoat in these representations. In the aftermath of the collapse of the firm, Sude became an icon of fraudulent speculative finance. Her name is still used to this day in Albania in public discourse as a way to delegitimize other economic practices. Depictions of Cadona as a gypsy fortune teller replicate the tropes of unpredictable, emotional, and hysterical behavior associated with speculative finance. This shift in registers from the powerful and honorable bosses to the fickle and hysterical gypsy fortune tellers represents a familiar discursive practice in the history of capitalism. As the GOAT notes, delusion and hysteria are the most salient and durable metaphors of crisis. Taken together, these discourses of entrepreneurship and of speculative finance serve simultaneously to legitimize certain policies and institutions that enable the firms, while framing the failing of these institutions and practices as externalities, as speculative bubbles and mania. So having talked about and deconstructed the discourse of speculation that played out around the firms, I turn to the practices of wealth accumulation and value conversion that took place through the firms. So one recurring theme in my conversations with former investors to the firms was the ubiquity of cash in circulation at the time. These accounts of abundance were perplexing to me given the multiple currency devaluations, rising unemployment, and economic dispossession that was also going on at the time. These accounts of abundance contrast with stories of virtual or illusory wealth that allegedly fuels the madness of the crowd or the irrational exuberance that is typical of representations of speculative bubbles. So these accounts also underscore the materiality of financial speculation. In the book, I then look into this materiality of the pyramid firms, and I note two specific pathways of wealth circulation and conversion that took place through the firms. On the one hand, I looked at the top-down processes of privatization and as a pathway of value conversion that generated a bifurcated path of dispossession for many and accumulation for a few. On the other hand, I explore bottom-up monetary repertoires of wealth accumulation through remittances and multiple currencies that flowed through the firms. The top-down process of value conversion is quite similar to other processes that are described for other Eastern European countries. So for instance, Catherine Verdery's famous chapter about the Romanian pyramid scheme Caritas, where she describes privatization of state property, provided these opportunities for the entrepreneurs to buy property at very low cost. Meanwhile, a system of distribution of shares in state enterprises through privatization vouchers in Albania, again, benefited the same groups of people who were also able to collect these vouchers at very low cost via informal currency exchange. I'm not going to read this quote, but basically the letra mevler or privatization vouchers, again, we're familiar with those in other former Eastern European countries. They were different in different places. In Albania, they had a nominal value, which you can see printed on the actual voucher, but then they were also exchangeable in the currency exchange markets, which is where they really got devalued. And the vouchers were the only way you could buy a public enterprise. So this was a way to ideally, this was a way to try to give ownership to the workers. But in practice, what happened is as the value of the vouchers, as they were devaluated, people in the know, people with connections would buy them at very low cost and then use them to purchase a state enterprise. I can talk about this more, but I'm more interested in the next pathway of value conversion, which has to do with the research on migrant remittances that were deposited at the firms. So this was a bottom-up financial repertoire that proliferated outside the banking system, and that was mediated by social networks among migrants. By tracing the circulations of remittances from migrants to kin to the firms, I discussed the materialities and socialities of financial speculation. I first realized the extent of the use of the remittances, but also the use of multiple currencies through the firms when Durim presented me with a ledger he had kept when working as a broker or sexer for the firm Gjalica. So I just want to note here that Durim and many others who were sexers was both a broker and an investor. So he also invested his own money. So Durim was an army officer during communism. He was laid off in the early 90s. He had moved back to Vlora, where it was his place of origin. And there he had worked as a trader in a farmer's market first, then a money changer, then finally as a broker with Gjalica. And this was all in a span of 4 to 5 years. So it gives you a sense of the really sense of instability and change that people were going through during those years. I met Durim in Vlora in 2008, where he worked as a security guard for an internet cafe. He shared his own ledger that he had still kept, where he listed the investors who deposited money to the firm through him. My first observation from this ledger was that most of the investors shared the last name with Durim. Now, I've muddled the last name for protection of privacy, but you can take my word for it, that these were all his kin, and this was a very common practice. So social networks among kin and among investors and brokers played a crucial role in recruitment of investors. The scenario that unfolded in Albania is not unlike other sites of pyramid schemes or money marketing schemes, where fraudulent firms mobilize social networks to draw more money. So for instance, the Bernie Madoff scheme that we're more familiar with also mobilized social networks of friends and family and acquaintances that Madoff had cultivated over a long period of time. Social norms of reciprocity, obligation, trust mediated the transfer of remittances to the firms. But the collapse of the firms also had a significant impact on restructuring social relations. So relations between generations were very fraught during this time, because it was the younger generation who was working abroad and sending remittances to the parents, and sometimes the decision to participate was not consensual. So the loss of that money caused friction, and it also reconfigured those relations. Also, the brokers, whether they were close relatives or distant acquaintances, received a lot of blame and distrust. So those relations also were fraught. So overall, these dynamics speak to the intertwined relationship of money and social ties that undergirded the firm's activities. My second observation from this ledger had I noticed that it had different columns for different currencies. So going from left to right, we see the lek, the US dollar, the Greek drachma, and the Italian lira, and the German mark. One first thing we can notice here is that this is a time before the euro, first of all. But also this ledger basically contains traces of the geographies of migration patterns at this time. Migrants sent remittances in currencies of their host country. Drachma from Greece, the country with the most Albanian migrants, and then lira from Italy, the country with the second most migrants, followed by other currencies from other European countries and the United States. And you can see here that the lek dominates, and the second one is drachma. So a lot of the people that were depositing in drachma. I should also say that part of this phenomenon was also that the schemes, actually, the firms accepted deposits in multiple currencies, and they returned interest in those currencies as well, something that the banks didn't do. The emerging cash economy and the flow of remittances in multiple currencies were a key form of wealth channeled through the firms. Attention to these bottom-up practices brings forth a more complex picture of financial speculation in neoliberal times. Among other things, these practices underscore the mutual imbrication of processes of formalization and informalization of the economy, the multiple entanglements of capitalist economies with other logics and practices of accumulation, and the new monetary practices and repertoires that emerge at the interstices of these logics. They also underscore how financial speculation can take hold through highly personalized transactions rather than the abstraction of capital, which is the narrative that we usually get from about the schemes. Further, as I explained towards the end of the book, migration and remittances constitute an enduring economy that continues to play a crucial role as a buffer to ongoing economic instability and crisis. And just as a little quote here from one of the participants who had migrated before the schemes, come back with her husband. Her whole family was in migration. They came back because her husband was the youngest son, and by Albanian traditional norms, the youngest son is to take care of the parents. But they also saw this opportunity with the schemes, and so they hoped to multiply their wealth much quicker than they would by continuing to work abroad. And so she said, "It was the sweat of mine, my husband's labor, both husband and wife. We suffered migration and then came and threw it all into the firms." So there is a part of this narrative too is sort of different calculations that people had about sort of changing, arbitrating the temporalities of work and life through the schemes. And speaking of temporality, this is my next topic that I want to discuss. For many former investors, the boom and bust of the firms had also changed their individual life trajectories. Many described the collapse of the firms as lagging behind from their anticipated trajectory of the 90s. Discussions of temporality of both finance and life were often expressed by investors as they assessed their plans and their decisions to participate in the firms and the ensuing consequences of the firm's collapse and on their life trajectory. So for instance, Magnola, who I just cited, so she lost all her savings, her migrant savings, and her husband had to return to migration. So she was still the only one of her family staying in Albania at the time that I interviewed her, and she was taking care of the elderly while all her siblings, all her in-laws were, including her husband, were working abroad. So one such discussion of temporality often emerged in accounts of housing purchases and sales. So the home is a really important institution in Albania, and this was a really important institution during the time of the firms. In addition to remittances, another widespread practices of the 90s was selling one's recently privatized communist apartment for cash to deposit at the firms. This phenomenon took place in the aftermath of a massive privatization reform that passed the transformed state-owned housing into private property for the residents. This was a major shift in housing regime. And once again, this has been documented in other post-socialist, post-communist countries. And here we see a huge transformation from a state-owned housing regime to a real estate market. So many, ensuing this shift, many residents with no other sources of wealth became owners of these small apartments. But as these were small and deteriorating apartments or houses, the owners wanted to move or to build better housing. So in 1996, the peak of the schemes, many rushed to sell their apartments for cash, deposit the cash into the firms, and hope to double or triple it within 6 months or a year. And when asked what they plan to do with this cash, by and large, pretty much everyone I interviewed said they plan to buy a new apartment or a new house. So this was a major incentive or drive for participating in the firms. So Magnola, who I mentioned earlier, she didn't live in a city. She lived in a little town called Narta, where people had these small houses. Now this is not her house, but I'm going to explain why I'm using this. It's from this town where she lives. So she had gone so far as to demolish her communist era house in the village of Narta. She and her husband, as I mentioned earlier, had worked as migrants in Greece for 4 years. Their whole families were in Greece. They had returned to take care of their parents. They had deposited all their savings into Vefa and Jalica. And actually, Magnola was also a broker herself. She was managing all the deposits from her own siblings and in-laws that were abroad. So anyway, so they deposit their savings, and like I said, they planned to buy a new house, but they were so confident that this was going to go through that she actually demolished her old house. And so she says, I demolished her house. We had an Elbasanche house, 2 bedrooms and a hallway. My father-in-law had built it in the 60s. We had a strong desire to make a new house. That's all the Albanian wanted then, beautiful European house. And so I've highlighted these 2 terms. Elbasanche house refers to the house that her father-in-law had built in the 60s that followed a sort of approved plan by the Tirana Institute of Design. There were two plans, Elbasanche house and I think it was Shkodra house. So people were allowed to build their own houses at the time with some kind of subsidy from the government, but they had to follow a specific design. So in this photo, walking around Narta, I saw this a lot. You would see this old house, the one with the red roof, is the Elbasanche house, and then the white house in the background is a house that is built either through migrant remittances or through pyramid scheme gains. That's a more European house. Now, in the original design, the Elbasanche house was a significant improvement from the Ottoman-style homes. The Ottoman-style homes were built with mud bricks and outdoor bathrooms, whereas the Elbasanche house incorporated modern European styles by using bricks and indoor plumbing system. As such, Elbasanche house during communist times represented the communist modernity in the 60s and 70s. This was even more so the case with communist apartments, right? That they were also part of this communist modernity. By the late 80s, however, the Elbasanche houses and the communist apartments embodied a failed modernity that many were eager to leave behind. Magnola's plan was to build a European house with more bedrooms, more balconies, a French as opposed to a Turkish bathroom, and so on and so forth. For other investors who had sold their urban communist apartments, their hopes were to also relocate closer to the center of the cities. And in many cases, the center of the city, for instance, in Tirana, the capital, is considered as more European than the sort of periphery. Sadly, Magnola had lost all her migrant savings to the firms. She described to me the horrible time she had during the following years, where she had scrambled until she was able to begin building a new home, thanks to the remittances, the ongoing remittances from her family abroad. Magnolas and other stories of loss of home speak to desired, failed, and actual temporalities of life and finance that intertwined with investors' decision to participate in the firms. On the one hand, by promising multiple gains, the firms provided a pathway for an accelerated temporality of wealth accumulation. This was highly desired given the unpredictable temporalities of life in the post-communist context. Unemployment was high, jobs were insecure, income from remittances were sporadic and unpredictable. People experienced what Jane Geyer describes as temporality of punctuated present, and they yearned for a more modernist temporality of predictable near future. Another meaning of temporality that I use here, and that for me emerged in these accounts of housing sales and purchases, relates to what I describe as a temporality of Europe. This is something that a number of contemporary Albanian scholars, Gerda Dalipai, Dimitri Dalakoglu, and Natasha Bon, have been writing about as well. So there is a dual temporality here when people talk about Europe or European houses. This temporality reaches forward towards a future in European political and economic space, so EU accession, but it also reaches back to a timeless past that imagines a European cultural identity and belonging that predates the Ottoman times. So whenever people in Albania are talking about Europeanness, I say that there's this dual temporality at play. And this dual temporality materializes in European things like commodities, designs, styles, political platforms, and homes. By investing their cash returns from the pyramid firms into the desired European homes, I argue that investors sought to appropriate these sociocultural qualities. Buying new European homes with pyramid firms' gains was simultaneously an effort at transforming their socioeconomic class and at materializing a temporal orientation towards Europe as a political and cultural horizon. Ultimately, by looking at these decisions and assessments of housing, I note how specific cultural aspirations played into people's decisions to participate in the firms. So in the last, towards the end of the book, sort of as my last theme that I explore in the last chapter in the epilogue, I reflect on the enduring aspect of pyramid firms to the present. Here, I identify three instances. I'm going to just very briefly mention three instances of continuity and analogy that I notice between the economies and cultural logics of the firms and how they manifest themselves in the present. So number one, the speculative economic logics of the firms are replicated in other contemporary financial practices. In the book, I discuss the example of construction financing, which operates on a similar speculative, non-bank, social network-driven model of financing. And this was something that actually, again, emerged from my fieldwork. Former investors drew this analogies for me. And I continue to actually study that even beyond the book. Second, I noted in the earlier chapters how investors sought to access different regimes of value as a way to hedge risk and uncertainty. And I know that this modality of wealth accumulation is a prevalent mode of wealth making in Albania to this day, as is the remittance economy, which provides access to other currencies and value regimes, and which continues to serve as a buffer to economic precarity. And third, aspirations towards a European political and cultural belonging that I mentioned towards the end are also prevalent in Albanian discourse. These aspirations are political, and that there is a expressed aspiration towards EU accession, which actually just very recently happened after my book was sent to press. But this is a continuous aspiration, and it's also cultural in the sense that I just described, that people continue to aspire to European consumer lifestyle as being superior cultural and aesthetic regime. And to me, this speaks also to a process of self-orientalizing that has been taking place in Albania for many decades. Finally, in exploring these continuities, the book emphasizes the Albanian peculiarities, such as the specific form of communism and post-communism, the relationship to Europe, the migration patterns. It also emphasizes the global resonances of the Albanian case, so specifically the neoliberal logics of accumulation, the temporalities of a punctuated present, the aspirations towards alternative modernities, and the intertwining of neoliberal economies with non-capitalist economies such as those of kinship and migration. So in the end, I hope that this book then speaks to Albanianists, to Balkanists, and to scholars of finance, more broadly speaking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to take questions.
Dr. Musaraj, thank you very much. I was enjoying myself so much by listening to some of the processes, because I believe that actually your book and the processes that you describe have actually wider applicability. I'm sure that a lot of the people in the audience will be happy to comment, make questions, have seen those patterns outside in the wider Balkan area in a good sense. But if you allow me to start with several. Oh,
Oops. For some reason I can't.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I was wondering, on your thoughts and comments on this fascinating, multifaceted phenomenon, which has touched the lives of several generations of people that live in Albania, but also, I would argue, in different Balkan countries. When you have spoken to and interviewed the investors, the brokers, I was wondering, did you discover sort of a sense of being a victim? And if so, are you familiar with instances where the people that have lost their investments attempted a collective action of some sort after 97? And also, were these people in any sense prosecuted by the law, or have they met any more serious consequences after this period? I know it's a lot, but it's just a cluster of questions,
No, that's great, because it's hard to talk about everything in the talk. But yes, all of the firm leaders were prosecuted eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Kadona was prosecuted first. I should say Kadona is the smartest, because she actually admitted it. She said, I didn't know. I ran a pyramid scheme. And so she went to prison, but then for some reason, and I don't remember why, she actually got her sentence reduced significantly. So she was out of prison before everyone else. Ali Muchai also was prosecuted. It was a really big trial. His firm was one of the last to fold. And when Kadona's was folding, he really tried to distance himself and say, she's the fraudulent one. I am we are the real. And a lot of people believed this. So, but anyway, eventually he was prosecuted, and he was also in prison. And he actually, like I said, he was still in prison when I was there in 2008. So he had a longer life term. Other ones actually escaped. Those who could. So a few others. One actually, during the time of my research, was found in Brazil. So he was brought back to Albania, but a number of the other ones escaped. I know one went to Turkey, and so. But anyway, but they were all considered illegitimate. The government actually hired Deloitte and Touche and PricewaterhouseCoopers House to investigate them, to do the accounting. So when they collapsed, they were considered completely illegitimate, and they were prosecuted. In terms of your question of the victims, did you mean the investors and the brokers, or the people?
No, the investors and the brokers. I was also interested in when we started mentioning those, whether we have instances actually of violence. Did any of these people get hurt? Eventually some of them fled, and I'm just thinking of similar instances where certain people paid dearly, for running those schemes. But victims, I was thinking of the sense of victims on the part of the investors, of the people that have lost, and it just stuck with me so much, the quote about the sweat of my husband's work.
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. There's a deep sense of victimhood. So actually, I think people were very astute in a number of ways. For one thing, yes, they turned against the firms, but they very quickly realized that the real culprits was the state authorities that had allowed the firms to run and that had benefited from the firms. The firms actually gave money to the political parties. They sponsored their campaigns and all of that. So the anger was mostly directed towards the government. In terms of so the whole anarchy, you could say, was a sort of social movement, right? That was, this was not the only issue. After there was a new government, the president finally resigned, and there was actually an international peacekeeping force that came through Italy to appease the violence in '97, and then there was a new government. So with a new government, there were a lot of initiatives, and there was a lot of hope that they would do a lot of restitution, and it actually didn't happen. There was very minor. So a lot of people I talked to had gotten like 10% of their deposit or something was very symbolic. One of the groups, I didn't talk about this in the lecture, but I talk about it in the chapter on housing. I did meet with, so there was a very small group of investors who had lost their houses. They had sold their apartments. They were mostly apartments, not houses. And there were groups in Tirana and Vlora. And one of them started this protest. Every day they would just show up to a sort of peaceful protest. At some point, they even had a hunger strike. But basically, initially, there had been a promise that there would be funding for people to regain their housing. And actually, the Greek government gave money to Albania for the people who lost their housing. It never really materialized, right? So there was this two small groups of people that were able to, eventually they got this subsidized housing. But the only way that they could claim it was not just because they could say that I sold my house to the pyramid scheme, but they had to have some other conditions. So they had to have some person with disability or something. So it was almost like social housing. And that caught a lot of media attention, but it didn't represent the number of people. Like 40 families got these apartments. And the apartments were actually built with the money from VEFA on a construction site that VEFA had started, right? So there was that. But then by the time I interviewed people there, the government had started asking them for paying. It wasn't given for free, and people sort of wanted it for free. And so there was a lot of issue about whether they were going to be able to hold on to that housing. So that was the most prominent one in terms of people mobilizing. And this was later, like 2001, 2002, 2003. So it was, 3-4 years after.
I just wanted to see, is there any questions from anyone here in the chat room? I think, Chris, why don't you go ahead and go first? And then Maria.
Thank you. Okay. Hey, Smoki, thank you so much for that. That was really, really enjoyable and interesting. I had a question, and maybe you touched on this a little bit, was the way that these Ponzi schemes may have been attracted to various peoples, maybe regionally or ethnically, maybe rural, urban. And did you see that particular groups of people sort of attached to one, maybe because of some kind of client patron relationship with the head of these things, and also I guess on top of that, as a that would follow from this was did these Ponzi schemes kind of aggravate pre-existing social cleavages that were maybe latent but really kind of brought them to the surface?
I'm smiling because in some ways the schemes united everybody. And everyone said that they were very excited about this. So they ran across political lines. So you could be that was the sort of biggest cleavage there, was that ultimately when the violence and anarchy took place, the blame was put primarily on the president, who was the leader of the Democratic Party, which is the first opposition party that came out of communism. In terms of the other demographics, not really. I would say people in the South maybe were more predominantly involved. Because people from the South were the ones that had these migrant remittances. The majority, but people from all over Albania migrated. And then second, a number of the firms, like I said, were concentrated, like their headquarters in Tirana, which is the capital, and Vlora, which is in the south. And actually the violence and anarchy really happened in Vlora. But actually, there's no, I mean, they really were very unifying in that sense and very democratic. People from rural areas participated in mass, and part of the way that they participated is that, for instance, one of the people that I interviewed that I mentioned here, who was praising Ali Muchai, he was an interesting case because he basically would go to his village. He lived in Vlora, which is a city, but he still had really strong ties with the village community, and he would go and sort of scoop up all the money, right, from everyone. And one of the interesting patterns of these investments was that a lot of times people pooled their money together and they invested it as one deposit. So legally you'll find one name, but actually there's like 3 or 5 people or maybe 10 people behind that name. So there's this informal aspect. But so he described how he and other people would go and mobilize people from the rural areas, because people from the rural areas wanted to move in the city. People from the cities wanted to move to other places, you know, from periphery to center. So there was really, I mean, I think the only distinction is that maybe people from the south more than people from the north participated, and that had to do with their economic resources. They had better resources than the north. But nonetheless, pretty much everyone, there was no discrimination when it came to the pyramid schemes. There was some accounts of people from abroad sending money too. I don't think it was that massive, but I think towards the end there were Italians and Greeks that supposedly also sent money because it seemed like it was, you know, a good opportunity. But after just to answer your question in terms of the aftermath, so the violence and anarchy that ensued did create more of a cleavage between North and South, and that was how also the president portrayed it to his supporters. And this North and South dynamic has existed. The Democratic Party has more votes in the North, and the Socialist Party has more votes in the South. So that those tensions played out a little bit.
Thank you so much for that. Maria, did you have your hand up? Sidorkina?
Sure, thank you. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I've just taught the 1990s in Russia to my students this week. So I was trying to show them a commercial of the MMM scheme. So hard to explain, but I was curious about, you framed your talk in the beginning. Also just wanted to say, there seems like your book is really timely. There's like I think a lot of interest in the 1990s right now in the sort of post-Soviet, post-socialist sphere. And I think because, anthropologists and sort of cultural and intellectual historians are sort of just getting there, although with some exceptions. So it will be really great to have another book to teach with. So my question is, you framed your talk or your book by saying that you're sort of, working against this idea that these are sort of, irrational, right, Albanians, like Orientalist narratives, but also against the idea that these are people who didn't know how the market worked, right? But I'm kind of curious about that because a lot of the, like the stuff I read about 1990s, like Soviet Union, like people really did have no idea in a sense. Like you hear like miners striking in '89 and saying that the free market is going to give them more control over their own labor, like completely using like the language, saying the word free market, but having really no clue at all that actually under the free market, their jobs would disappear overnight. There would be no protectionist measures at all. And obviously these pyramid schemes are not, right, as like, there is something sort of on the ground kind of learning about the market that does somehow, or at least on an everyday basis, right, how do investments live in the country that does change? And I was wondering if any of you informants, you said that they became kind of more aware that it was the state's fault that they allowed this to happen, but I wonder if they also had some sort of narratives of coming to understand, right, how profits and markets did actually kind of work for ordinary people, or mostly didn't work for them, I guess.
Yeah. So it is true, right, that people had no experience with market economy, and especially Albania was even more extreme than some of the other Eastern European countries where there was some private property. Albania really had banned private property. But for one thing, that disappearance of the market had happened progressively. It didn't just happen as soon as World War II ended, and we have other historical accounts that show how these different ways of centralizing, right, and collectivization, right, that took over time. So the generation I spoke to, obviously we're all born in the late 60s and 70s, so maybe not all of them had a memory of this, but yeah, so that's one point. In terms of how people talked about it, there was a mixture, but every now and then I would have someone who said, we knew these were not sound, economically sound, but since the president is supporting these firms, because the president, I didn't include it in the talk, but I talk about this a lot in the book, the president at the time came out in public after the IMF had warned against these firms. He came out to defend them and said, this is Albanian money, it's honest money, these are informal businesses, but they're as honest as they can be, or whatever. So basically he framed them as informal, but honest and capitalist. And so people may have had their own views about, so they thought, okay, this is corrupt, but the government is supporting them, so why not? So that was one attitude. Another attitude was someone who was, interestingly, knew about capitalism through Marxist philosophy, because everybody was trained in Marxism, right? So he was like, money doesn't grow on trees, okay? So he said, like, he knew this was not like good market, like, it's not like it was good investment, solid investment, but once again, he had invested in the firms and thinking that I'm going to take my money out before it collapses. So that's one part of it. But the other part of why I say that, I want to sort of downplay the narrative of ignorance of capitalism is that the way that these firms gained ground is precisely because they showed that they were participating in these new institutions, right? So they bought property from privatization. They had investments. They were using these people as shareholders, and so now, of course, we can say that this was distorted, right? That there were no rules, and it's true, there were no auditing mechanisms at all at the time. So that also is what sort of led to all this financial mismanagement. But I don't want to separate them. Those are, so basically the institutions of capitalism, and this is also a critique of the sort of neoliberal reforms that were taking place in Albania and how they took hold and how they took place in this shock therapy mode. And I think this were the results of that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Is there anyone else with their hands up or questions? I see one. Who is that?
I think Dan.
Oh,
I
Dan,
think
sorry.
Dan.
It was weird. It came up in a weird spot. Okay, Dan, go ahead.
So I don't want to get too conspiratorial about this, but how was the money that flowed to the initial investors, was it taxed?
Did you say, was it taxed?
Yes.
No. Well, that's one of the major things that did not happen in Albania in those first few years. There was no taxing. There's no tax system in place.
Okay. Well, I didn't know, and this, I guess, to me, kind of a follow-on question to that was like, did the Albanian people have any sort of investment alternative?
They didn't, and this is one of the reasons why people invested. I think because they didn't, and also, the firms, like I said, they straddled the two fields of formal and informal norms. And so they had connection with the banks. They actually deposited some of their deposits to the banks. The firms did. So they had the connection with the formal banking system, but they were not audited, they were not regulated as a bank. Some of them claimed that they were going to apply to become a commercial bank. Now I lost track of your question, but basically, so because of that, they had very loose rules about how people could invest and when they could withdraw their deposits. So that it was very, so from the perspective of investors, this was considered as very flexible. It was very accessible. So for instance, there were, let's say, if someone wanted to buy a house, first of all, there was not a lot of commercial banking, not a lot of credit lines. But even for the banks that had credit lines, the rules for eligibility were very harsh for Albanians because they didn't have any collateral, they didn't have any savings. A lot of them didn't have a job, so they couldn't show like, okay, I'm employed somewhere, right, to pay for the credit, for the mortgage. And so they really didn't have access to the formal financial system. So this is why one of the ways that I talk about the firms is that these were a sort of alternative, right, to the financial system. And these were the only alternative for a lot of people that wanted to invest. And there was actually, with investment, there's also this pleasure in investing, right? This was something new that Albanians didn't do before. So people really felt like so good because they were investors in a joint stock company. So definitely, I mean, this is how I write about it in the book, is that these, if we bracket the fact that we know they were fraudulent, we know they caused a lot of harm, but looking at it from the perspective of people, investors, this was an alternative way of circulating money, of making money, of getting a credit, or getting something that they could use to then buy a house or buy other things as well, like a car or whatever. But when you asked about the conspiracy theories, I thought you were going to, because I can share, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about this that involve President Bush II.
Interesting.
Gaddafi. There is a lot of very interesting. So the idea was that because the people asked, where did all this money go? Because people had seen the stacks of cash, right, in the firms, and then all of a sudden the firms didn't have any money. So then the conspiracy theories were about how they were brought with bags of cash to this boat in the Adriatic where George Bush. So you guys, United States had a role in this to play as well.
Well,
I wasn't
sorry, go
thinking,
ahead.
I wasn't thinking conspiracy that broadly. I was kind of, this is a government that's relatively new, and so any government needs revenue, and I was just kind of, because you've got the president making these comments about the legitimacy of these operations, and so I don't know, trying to follow the money a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so the one little thing, and I know there's some, and I think Chelsea's hands is up. So like I said, the government did gain from them in two major ways. They paid for, some of these firms paid for some of the campaigning so there was an election in 96 that was very contested because it was considered as completely illegitimate, and the ruling party won. And then the other way in which the government gained is that, so when they were campaigning, the Democratic Party was saying was something about winning, like with us you win, but basically the winning had two connotations. It was about the votes, but also about the money, because the government presented themselves as supporting the firms.
Okay, I think Chelsea had a question.
Yes, I do. Hi, thanks, Smoki. I'm so sorry I was late and I missed part of the talk. So this may have already been touched upon some, and I'm really excited to read the book. Congratulations on it. And one thing I kind of want to follow up. So while I wouldn't necessarily frame it all as conspiracy theory or conspiratorial, one thing I've come across is how often people do talk about the impact of losses in both relating to money, but then also property, which I know you cover some too, and feeling like Albania has been set up, so to speak, since '91, and then tying that to now different barriers faced to, like, getting EU acceptance and that sort of thing. And so I did want to hear more about that and how you've come across that in your work, not necessarily just like the conspiracies about George W., for example, but just the ways that people do feel that kind of like there's something against Albania, and it's something wrong with us and with Albanians, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very common feeling, and part of it actually. I lived in Albania up until '95. So I experienced the late communist period and the transition period, those first 5 years, and then the pyramid schemes collapsed in '97. And there's one thing, and this speaks to I think it was Maria's earlier comments about studying of the '90s. There's actually not a lot of stuff about Albania in the '90s, so I am happy to look into that period, because it is a very intriguing period. But one of the things that happened in the '90s is the early '90s, there was a lot of enthusiasm, there was a lot of optimism. People did feel like they were finally that they ended their own isolation, but that also the world was gonna embrace them. And there was also this euphoria, economic euphoria. People were like trying to figure out what they could do as entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. And the thing that was important, that sometimes is lost, I think, but I think people who lived in that period know really well, is that one of the biggest consequences of the collapse of the firm is precisely, it was like a double downer. You had gone through the 90, 89, 90, through that transformation, and now there was, of course, an economic slowdown there, but this one was a sort of like a reality check that, oh no, we're not that great, right? That we're actually even worse than we thought we were. So that really, I think, was a wet blanket on that initial optimism, and it has remained like that because, like you said, in the last 20 years, it's been so hard to make progress on the European Union accession, and Albania is constantly sort of left outside of the invited pool for different reasons. So part of it is a feeling of sort of being conspired upon by outsiders, but I think it's also a feeling that we're not good enough, like we're not doing a good job. Our governments,
right?
And so, for instance, I always say this, that what unites Albanians in terms of political platforms is going to Europe. But other than that, like, people are very cynical about any other kind of promises that any political party will give. But if you talk about going to Europe, they'll be like, okay, I'm with you. So that's sort of the only horizon of expectation that people have, as a sort of like, this will solve all of our problems. So anyway, but I think there is a very strong sense that we're not good enough. Everyone is corrupt. And it's based on the experience of having this crisis and changing very slowly, but people feel like they're not changing. There's not enough change, basically.
Yeah. And I know we can continue this conversation more so, but I also am really interested in that too, when it pertains to a lot of Roma and Egyptians, because you see a shared sentiment. Sometimes it's not Europe, it's just Germany, right? But like, there's this, I like what you said about the horizon, opportunity, because that's like really believed about Europe, about Germany, and what that represents, right? So anyways, thank you for that. Thank you, Smoki.
You're welcome. Happy birthday.
Thanks.
And I don't know if you missed the beginning. I talked about Suda, which was a Roma. I can share. I mean, you can see it in the book, but there was a discussion of that. And I also want to give you a heads up about that. So I'm co-editing a book on Albanian studies, and one of the contributions by Inkeleda Sulaj speaks about the Romas, and actually the parallel, a very quick parallel, I think you'll understand this very well, is she speaks about the Roma in the same way that Kathleen Stewart speaks about Appalachia vis-a-vis United States, right, as a sort of other space that's totally outside of this trajectory of modernity. So anyway, in Albania, it's sort of like a fractal, because Albanians themselves feel like they're outside of that trajectory of modernity, but the Roma community is even more outside of that trajectory. So yeah, absolutely.
Right. Oh, that sounds really good. And I've been in touch with Incaleta some, but it's been a while. But yeah, that sounds really great. And I think the story that you shared, I missed the beginning, but I think I have read it. I don't know if it was in a paper or maybe I've already looked something about the book. Yeah, an article. Okay, yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So I see actually that Samantha Farmer has a question. Samantha, do you want to go ahead and ask?
Yeah, thank you for your talk, Dr. Musaraj. These are actually not topics I specialize in. So I was taking a lot of notes and I apologize if you covered this.
Okay.
But I was really interested in the topic of remittances, in particular as a cash flow from abroad that I would assume is much more proportionally influential than local cash in just quantity. I'm wondering if you could talk about kind of the network of remittances, like what particular places were common for people to work as migrants, and was that temporary? How was the cash transported? And where did people work? Did they have autonomy in like deciding what their family invested that in, which firms?
So the majority of the migrants that sent remittances were they worked in Greece and Italy. And this was a massive migration that happened in the 90s. In Greece, people just crossed the border. It's illegal migration. So most of the people worked in construction and agriculture, so under the table. And so there was a lot of restrictions, and they found that it was not as easy to sort of make a lot of wealth with these jobs. And in Greece in particular, they experienced a lot of discrimination. There's a really strong anti-Albanian sentiment there. So anyway, so the remittances, so that's why in this ledger that I showed, you have the remittances in lek, which is Albanian money, but then the next one was in drachma, at the time was the Greek money. Now it's all euros, of course. And so the migration, there were different kinds. There was temporary migration, there was a long-term migration. There's a lot of people who kind of go back and forth. Like I said, it was mostly focused in the South. And when I've done other kinds of research projects there, the feeling that you get is that everyone has had some migration experience. It's like a coming of age experience. Like everyone has to have a migration experience and then they come back. So now I think in the last 20 years, there's actually more coming back than there was in that first 10 or 20 years for different reasons. Like after there was a Euro crisis, there was a lot of people that came back. Now with the pandemic, we might see sort of both ways, people going, people coming back. But at the time, like I said, these were the two main countries that sent people. And mostly they were sent informally by cash, either by themselves, people come back for certain holidays, or they send it with their friends or their family. And they were typically sent from like the children to the parents. The parents were back home, and sometimes the parents decided to invest this money by themselves without asking for permission. Sometimes it was a joint decision. And so that's why I said that those dynamics also caused friction within family dynamics, because some of the people I interviewed were really young. They were like minors. They were like in their 15, 16 years old when they had sent their money, and they were really annoyed because they worked really hard in construction, and their dad had put their money into the schemes, even though the laborer didn't want to. And so they had felt like not only they lost the money, but they lost all these years of working abroad. So the collapse of the schemes also changed the patterns of migration. A lot of people migrated again. People who had migrated and come back, they migrated again because they felt like there was no hope, right? So yeah, I hope that answers. I can go on about, I love the whole remittances thing. It was not something I thought I was going to study when I started working into this. So I was really excited that I noticed that through my field work, basically.
Well, Smoki, your talk was so wonderful, and I have like 10 different questions, which I don't have time to ask all of them. But I just wanted to ask one as our kind of final question here as we kind of wind down. And I guess I'm really interested in this idea of that you debunk this kind of notion of people sort of inexperience, I guess, with capitalism or et cetera. And it made me think of sort of two different things. One, and Albania is a special case, but I think that there was a large extent to which people under socialism were exposed to capitalism in a lot of different forms. People at the highest level of trade were dealing with, capitalists in their trade relations and marketing and all those kind of things. But even at lower levels, I think because the black market was so prevalent, more prevalent than the real market, there was, went to the Soviet Union in '89, and my boyfriend was not only trading goods, he was trading currencies, he was marketing in currencies. And so he had like 3-4 different hard currencies at any one time in his wallet. And so, so I was thinking of that, but then even in the post period, in some ways, the capitalism that people experience with shock therapy that you're talking about was a really harsh, cruel, and maybe more pure capitalism than one that people in the West had experienced. I mean, maybe we really haven't experienced pure risk capitalism because it's so regulated here and there's so many security nets kind of built into it and regulations. So maybe what they were experiencing, just the problem was that it was really like high risk, pure, cruel capitalism, with all that comes with it. Not that they weren't able to, it was like this juggle with, this, but that really was the thing. That really is what capitalism is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as I live longer, I live in the United States, I noticed that as we went through this period where a lot of regulatory systems were being dismantled. And I constantly am reminded of the Albanian experience, because I think you're right. I think the one major aspect, and other people have written about this, Verduri has written about this, was this lack of regulatory mechanism made the experience of capitalism the sort of, this really rough. But I have to say that even with that, and I think this is one of the themes that I want to underscore throughout the book, is even with that, there are other systems, right? In any capitalist system, there's also other economies. So for instance, this migration economy is a different kind of economy that doesn't necessarily follow the capitalist logics, because it's sent through family, right? And it's not based on maximization of profit or whatever. So I think that is important to bring in, that those economies existed as well. As to your first question, so yes, Albania was much more communist than the rest of the Eastern Bloc. So for instance, there really wasn't a lot of trade with outside, but I should say there was a black market. So yes, and interestingly, okay, so this is one interesting thing. The reason why the president said in the 90s that these are informal companies, therefore they're good, is because people associated informal with black market, with capitalism under communism, hence good. So there was this weird, and in general, so the one term I didn't use here because I don't want to overwhelm you is FIDE, which means money lending. And it's a term that was vilified during communism because money lending with interest was considered, very immoral. But because it was vilified during communism, then people who used it in post-communism embraced it as a good capitalist thing.
Thank you very much for addressing this. We have, literally, your talk has sparked so much interest, and we have all these questions and debates, and we're listening carefully. One last question by our PhD student, Keith Wagner. Keith?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It did spark a lot of different directions to go thought-wise. I really liked what you said about the dual temporality of Europeanness. So aside from the accession to the EU you're talking about, you talked about this idea of reaching back to a timeless past and sort of like that false nostalgia. So I'm wondering, where does that discourse circulate? Is it in literature, or where does this sort of like, we used to be one Europe before the Ottomans and that sort of thing?
Everywhere.
Okay.
including communist discourses of cultural identity. So this idea of reclaiming our identity as European emerged in different places. It emerged actually in nationalist literature, and it was part of the sort of nationalist movement against the Ottoman Empire and trying to show that our history is different than the Ottoman history. But then it's also embraced. Now, of course, during communism is different because the communist government is very much against Western European countries, but they still try to show that we had this sort of identity that was prior to the Ottoman times. But then after the 90s, this is everywhere. So all political parties, like I mentioned, in their platforms are all, especially after 97, their main promise is we'll bring you to Europe. And then it's also part of media and, like I said, sort of cultural aesthetics. It's in, when the current prime minister gives a public contract to an architecture firm, it's a French architecture firm or it's an Italian architect, it's this fetishization of Europeanness. But anyway, and then there's also like the famous Albanian writer Ismail Kadare wrote about Albanian identity as being sort of this Christian European identity as opposed to the Muslim Ottoman. So it percolates everywhere. But it is a enduring temporality. That's sort of one thing that Albanians say. That sort of it's a counter to what Chelsea mentioned earlier, the sense of marginalization. It's sort of countered with these claims to belonging to this European culture.
Thank you very much. We do appreciate your time, your very interesting presentation. I'm pretty sure that the book will be well read. And it obviously opens so many avenues for commentaries, for thought. Thank you for coming once again. We do appreciate
Thank you all.
your...
This was a great audience. And anyone, if you want to ask questions by email, I know that we don't have more time, but thank you so much. This was a great audience and great questions.
Thank you very much. With this, we would like to close today's session to remind that next week we are having another interesting guest, Emily Grebel. Consider coming. Please, if you can. Not all sessions, as you know, are recorded. Maybe this will be the case with the one that's next week. And also, I would love to ask everyone to participate in our survey. As you know, this is the second season or second year, in running Balkan Circle, and we appreciate feedback from all of you, whether it's academic or non-academic audience, because that helps us very much so with calibrating and improving each and every time, making the seminar even more exciting, but most importantly, planning, because as we have spoken in the beginning, there aren't very many seminars dedicated to the Balkans, and we would like to cater to all interests of the participants, as you know, they are widely ranging from literature to archaeology. Once again, thank you very much again for coming, and thank you for presenting. It was fantastic. Thank you.